And yet this very identification is the very thing Counter-reformation rapture theology will literally bend the text over backwards to completely ignore.
These locusts
gonna be banging at your windows, and it's all you can do to keep them out.
They're obviously demon locusts.
All this is a part of the plan of God. All this demonic plague that's coming on the earth is God's plan.
It won't do no good dog called a orc and pest man, because the bug spray of man cannot overcome the power of God to torture you people, okay? And it won't do no good at all, because these here locust bugs is got faces of men and look like horses running into battle. And that's a pretty strange looking locust bug. You see what I'm saying? Looky here, ma'am. We can't kill no demonic locust bugs from the book of Revelations, but we gotta order that all the way from Rome, Italy, and it's gonna take at least, guess what, 5 months to get there. 5 months, you're gonna have to wait on your holy water to come all the way from the Vatican in Italy on a boat across the Indian Ocean and all that. And it's like in the world in tribulation, so you don't have to sit in on the boat because it's like airplanes falling out of the sky because people get raptured and everything.
So the fifth trumpet, according to John, would begin around 312 AD and be marked by astronomical events involving first, the appearance of a comet or asteroid in the sky, which did occur in 141 AD, and then 168 years later, will be followed by a fairly large meteor impact in 312 AD. Was there a fairly large meteor impact around 312 AD? Yes, there actually was. It was precisely in 312 AD, and it is directly connected to what John is prophesying in history in this text. Once these events occur in history, the woe in this prophecy is fulfilled. And it is done. And this completes John's astronomical dating for the first prophecy.
And that battle is described in Revelation chapter 9, verses 14, 18. This is Armageddon. And ISIS is there. Listen to this. Loose the 4 demons in the great river Euphrates. To slay a third part of mankind. The number of the army was 200,000, 200 million. And by these 3 was a third part of men killed. Fire, smoke, brimstone, atomic warfare. See more of that in a moment. Yeah. It's all here. Minor nations, the Muslim nations, are coming into it. Let's get into it, Rexella.
To understand Revelation chapter 9, there is some historical background information we need to cover first, and we need to examine some glossary terms. There are 21 verses in this chapter which cover two prophecies. Those prophecies are astronomically dated historically, to the Middle Ages. And the descriptions of those armies are given by John, with some amazing detail. But John expresses those details in descriptions which make use of symbolism, idiomatic expressions and visual metaphors, to describe what he is seeing. And all of this language is historically contexted, within the culture and language, that John is writing in. Without any reference to that information, you will end up not having a clue what John is actually talking about, which is precisely where Counter-reformation ministers end up taking their audiences. So here is a list of terms and phrases we will examine historically, before we begin. First, in verse 1, in the English translation, we read the term bottomless pit. If you don't know what a bottomless pit is, how would you ever know if anyone was ever given a key from it? So we need to examine this term. Counter-reformationists claim this is a real pit that goes into the center of the earth, and has no bottom. Apparently never realizing or caring that their claim is not only based totally on ignorance about the world, geology and physics, but it is also just a lame cover story, to hide the actual contents of the text. Secondly, John mentions scorpions 3 times in verses 3, 5 and 10 of this chapter, in his description of the first army. Everyone knows what a scorpion is, right? Well, you might be surprised to learn a scorpion was not just a venomous insect. It was also a very famously feared military weapon, used by the Roman Empire. And it is unmistakably clear in these texts, John is making reference to it. Thirdly, counter-reformationists claim based on verse 6, these texts teach that people will not be allowed to die. So that during their mythological tribulation period in the future, which will never happen anyway, of course, their magical locusts that live in the center of the earth will come out and sting everyone and they won't be able to die. They will be like zombies or the undead, and no one will be able to die, just so God can torture them some more. That too is a ridiculously fantastical false claim, and you will see from the text, how to easily see through this lie. Because they contradict their own claim, by following it with the direct opposite claim 1/3 of humanity will be killed. So obviously you can't have it both ways. And what the text really teaches in that verse is extremely realistic history, and did in fact occur, precisely in the time frame John puts it in, with the astronomical dating of his texts. Fourthly, in verse 9, John mentions that this army he is prophesying about also has breastplates made of iron. Iron is a very heavy metal. Because of this, no one makes breastplates of iron, for military purposes. Except for the fact, at one precise place on earth, and at one precise period of history, someone actually did that. And John prophesied it, before it happened. And he makes an unmistakable specific reference to it, in verse 9. Fifthly, in verse 11, John specifically states, the army he is prophesying about, will have Apollyon as their king. The definition and description of this deity is neither mystical or unclear. It is brazenly clear what John was referring to in that text, but unfortunately it is usually intentionally, completely hidden, from public audiences by counter-reformationist ministers. So we will need to review the identity of the deity's important historical background, to his prophecy. Sixthly, we will need to look at the text in verse 14 and examine the claim that the statement about the 4 angels which are bound by the river Euphrates is a reference to mythology and folklore, the 4 demons which were thrown in the river, by a sorcerer, and come back out during the tribulation, to kill 1/3 of all humanity on earth. It is not unusual for counter-reformationists to give credence to sorcerers and magicians, and actually quote them as sources, in their interpretations of biblical texts. But that is not what the text is actually saying. They have once again mangled these texts beyond recognition, and we will have to clear that up. Seventhly, we will need to find out what is brimstone, since it is claimed that brimstone is a reference to atomic warfare, and the text says that this brimstone comes from their mouths. So John is being quite specific about what he is referring to concerning this army. And his reference to this fire coming from their mouths is pretty unmistakable. So what is brimstone, and how is it coming from their mouths? Counter-reformationists cannot tell you what any of this means, because if they do, they can no longer fool you into accepting their Counter-reformation teachings on Revelation. So that is why they can't tell you what any of it means, even if they know. And lastly, we need a quick math lesson on the Greek phrase myriads of myriads, used in verse 16. Counter-reformationists claim this is a reference to the number 200 million, which is what you get if you multiply one myriad of 1,000 with another myriad of 1,000. The only problem is, if you had done that in ancient Greece in the 1st century, most Greeks would have walked away from you, shaking their head and laughing at you, as a complete and total idiot. Why? Because to an ancient Greek, it didn't mean that at all. After we look at these terms and items of historical context, we will go through the text verse by verse, and see what John was really saying, and how it was fulfilled in real history. The first term we will look at in our glossary lesson for Revelation chapter 9 is the term bottomless pit. Everyone assumes they know what a bottomless pit is. In English it is a pit that is bottomless. That's simple enough. The only problem is that these Greek words are used in other places in the New Testament, and they are never translated this way. So why here? That is a very good question. But first let's look at the other places in the New Testament where these Greek words are actually used. The English translation, bottomless pit, comes from the Greek phrase, to phriatos tes abuso. In that phrase, phriatos is translated as the word pit, and abuso is translated as bottomless. The terms to and tes are simply the Greek articles. So the expression is literally, the phriatos, the abuso. The U sound, at the end of it, is genitive and means, of, or belonging to. Transliterated into English, this phrase would read, the phriatos, of the abuso. The Greek word abuso is the origin of the English word, abyss, which means, the deep, in the English dictionary. And is also the root word of the term abysmal, which means very bad, and also very deep. Abyss and abysmal are a dual reference to something bad and something deep. This etymology reflects the earlier origins of the term, abyss. But there is an unsolved mystery in how this term is used in the New Testament. If you look up the term abyss in a biblical dictionary, encyclopedia or lexicon, the explanations will bounce all over the place about it. Sometimes the explanations will literally contradict themselves in the very same article attempting to explain it. The explanations range from the abode of demons, to the place of the dead, to never the place of the dead, to bottomless pit, to the waters under the earth, from alleged ancient erroneous cosmologies, to virtually anything else you can possibly imagine. Why all the confusion over this term? It becomes pretty obvious, when you look into this term, something is missing from all these explanations. This Greek term is used 34 times in the Greek Septuagint, and it is translated almost always as a reference to either the depths of the ocean, or the waters under the earth, that are the source of wells and fountains, which we now call the aquifers. It is never used in the Septuagint to refer to a bottomless pit. Never. And there really isn't any confusion about its use. It is used in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 precisely the same way it is used in its last instances in the Septuagint in Habakkuk chapter 3 verse 10. So there is no confusion over this term. It meant the deep, referring to the ocean or the aquifers, just as the term abyss means in English. And it was never used to refer to the Hebrew word Sheol, or the Hebrew conception of the place of the dead. Not even one time. The problems come strictly from how the term abyss is used in the New Testament. But its use in the New Testament is really not a problem at all. In fact, the use of the term in the New Testament is a very targeted and strategic use of this term to address only one particular audience. And that is why the term is only used when that one particular very specific audience is being addressed. If you will be honest about the New Testament's odd use of this term, and it will use this term in a way that is completely inconsistent with its use in the Greek Old Testament Septuagint, then you will find the New Testament's use of this term will become completely logical and self-explanatory. But that is a very, very big if, for ministers and theologians who have problems with honesty to begin with. But before we get to the term abyss, which is translated as bottomless, let's examine the other word which is translated as pit. because it has some problems in translation as well. John uses the term phreatos, which is translated as pit. Johannine literature uses that Greek word twice outside of the book of Revelation, in the New Testament in John chapter 4 verses 11 and 12. And in both of these cases, the term that is used to translate it into English is the term, well, not pit. In both cases. In the English Standard Version, which keeps the translation of this term consistent, the term is translated consistently into English as the word, well, again, even in Luke chapter 14 verse 5 too. So technically the word translated as pit does not really mean pit as it is translated. It is actually the word for a well. That is a very big deal. So why did some translators choose the term pit instead of how it is being used by John to mean well? Once again, this is because that is how this term was used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And there it was the word pit. But that is not how Johannine literature is using the term in the New Testament. Remember that. Its use is clear in the New Testament, and it means, well, not pit, as you will usually be told. Just simply look up the other references and you will see there is a problem with that translation. Look at John chapter 4 verses 11 and 12 and Luke 14 verse 5. Look those verses up in multiple translations, which you can find online, and you will immediately see there is a problem with how it gets translated inconsistently. But even given this discrepancy, even if you don't believe what you are being told about this term in this video, simply ask yourself what is the most obvious thing that both wells and pits have in common? It should be pretty obvious to you what the term is pointing at. They are both man-made entryways into subterranean locations for some specific purpose. In the case of a well, it is for water, and in the case of pits, it is a storage area for material or debris. But both are entries into subterranean locations. So whether you translate it as pit, or you translate it as well, if you focus on what both of these translations mean, you can end up with the same idea, even though the words may be different. But there are some important differences between a well and a pit. Some big differences. A well is all about water, and a pit is not. But in both cases, they are both man-made structures, and they both protrude into the earth, or in other words, they are subterranean areas. To be absolutely specific and literal with this term, you could consider it a cognate for our modern English descriptive word, subterranean. Because it is being used as a descriptive term like an adjective, rather than as a noun itself. Everyone can admit that whatever else this term means, it is clearly something under the ground. It is an adjective describing something subterranean. But in the case of a well, it has an association with water, just like the term abyss or abuso, which means the deep, but is translated as bottomless. Pit, on the other hand, has no linguistic association with water at all. So you see why it matters if the term is well or pit. The phrase, the well of the deep, means something quite different in English than the phrase, the pit of the bottomless. So it matters how this is being translated. The noun itself is actually the second term. That term is abuso. When the New Testament uses the term abuso, the translators claim this term means bottomless. But once again, is that how this term is used in other places in the New Testament? And once again, the answer to that question is, no, it is not. In fact, bottomless is not even the way the term is used in the Greek Septuagint. There is literally nothing about its use in the Septuagint that even implies anything bottomless at all. So you cannot honestly make the claim here that this bad translation is based on the Septuagint. Because that's not how the Septuagint even uses the term. Aquifers are deep, but they are not bottomless. The depths of the oceans are deep, but they are not bottomless. It isn't sufficient to just claim primitive people thought oceans and aquifers were bottomless to justify this use of the English translation word, bottomless, because if you use that logic in modern language translation by interpreters, you would never get what was actually said by anyone. Let's test that translation logic. We know that modern people believe too much sugar intake leads to diabetes. So every time we see the word sugar, let's just insert what we know they think, which is diabetes. Are you ready? Here's the original sentence. Now here is the translation. Hello diabetes, how are you today? Here's another original sentence. Now here is the translation. I love you so much. You are sweet as diabetes. Do you see why you cannot transpose external definitions onto the translation of a word? So when you read the English phrase, bottomless pit, in place of the Greek phrase, tu friatos te abuso, you need to remember that someone thought it would be a good idea to use the word diabetes, instead of what the word actually meant, which was sugar. It is the attempt to, let me tell you what it means. Instead of, or rather than, let the reader find out what it really means. It is an overeager or overzealous attempt to color the meaning of this phrase for the reader. That's not very honest, is it? The term, abuso, is also used 2 other places outside of John's use of it in Revelation. And in those 2 other places, both uses refer to the grave, or tombs, or generically, the place of the dead. And this is where the confusion begins with the term, abuso, which is really the word, abyss, in English. Not bottomless. But the way it is being used to refer to the place of the dead in the New Testament in these 2 uses is completely different than any use of the term in the Greek Septuagint. Ever. It is a completely different usage. The term abuso is never, not even a single solitary time, used to refer to Sheol, or the place of the dead, in the Greek Septuagint. And that is extremely important, because the apostles were actually teaching out of the Greek Septuagint to their first-century audiences. But here Paul, who is a professionally trained rabbi, employs the term abuso in a way that is completely outside the way it is used by the Septuagint. And there is a very important reason why this is the case. The term is first used in Luke chapter 8 verse 31, and its second use by Paul is in Romans chapter 10 verse 7. And both of these texts make it very, very clear they are using this term, abuso, to refer to the place of the dead. But that is not Jewish teaching. Something very odd is happening here. And it only happens 2 times in the entire New Testament, outside Revelation. Only 2 times in 26 entire books. This is an extremely rare occurrence, and in both cases it comes from the same literature group. The Epistle to the Romans and the Gospel of Luke had something unique to them that they shared in common, and in both of these literatures, we find the use of this term employed, in a very non-Jewish way. But the question that this inconsistent usage brings up to biblical scholarship is why would these New Testament writers take what was essentially a reference to the underground aquifers or the ocean depths, and apply it to refer to a place of the dead, which they do. This really doesn't make any sense at all, on the surface of it. Until we get to its use in Revelation. Then something absolutely amazing begins to unfold. Something the Counter-reformation would prefer you never find out about at all. And thus the overeager and overzealous attempts to substitute the word diabetes for the word sugar now begin to make sense. Scholars will point out that, in Hebrew, the term for the place of the dead, which was Sheol, and was never referenced in the Greek Septuagint translation of the Old Testament by the term abuso. And they are right about that observation. They will also explain that based on this fact, it never refers to the place of the dead, but obviously from the 2 texts in the New Testament outside of Revelation, that is precisely how it is being used by a professionally trained rabbinical teacher in Paul. What explains this mysterious discrepancy? Why would an unusual reference to subterranean water, completely inconsistent with the Septuagint which they were reading, also be used by New Testament writers to make a reference to a place of the dead? The answer to that mystery is found in a little-known and smothered historical context, which we will now look at. And you might want to buckle your seatbelt for this, because you are about to go into warp drive and end up in a brand new universe. The Greek term, abuso, is found in only 2 other places outside its use in Revelation. Those 2 places are in the Gospel of Luke and in the Epistle to the Romans. It is very important you remember who the book of Romans and the book of Luke were actually written to. Because it is here, in the historical context of their mutual audience, that the explanation for how this term is used becomes extremely apparent and virtually unmistakable. What do both the Gospel of Luke and the Epistle to the Romans have in common? What do both of these literatures share that makes their mutual use of this term, abuso, logical to use to refer to the place of the dead? and makes it logical to use, to refer to the place of the dead, completely outside Jewish teaching, theology and linguistic usage? What makes the use of the word, abuso, such a natural fit, to mean the place of the dead, in these two books? That doesn't fit anywhere else in the entire New Testament? Anywhere else? By any other writers? Both of these books were being written to the very same audience, and that audience was an audience in the city of Rome. And that is why you find the term abuso used to refer to the place of the dead in these two books. And nowhere else in the New Testament, or anywhere in its 34 uses in the Greek Septuagint written by Hebrew authors to Hebrew people who lived in the Middle East. There was something in Rome that made the use of the term abuso absolutely unique to the audience in Rome, and nowhere else. Well, what was it? The book of Luke came about as a result of Paul's sedition trial in Rome. The material contained in it was first collected by Paul's attorney, DUMMIES, mentioned in Titus 3 verse 13. After Paul's death, Luke, mentioned in Colossians 4 verse 14 as his personal physician and a disciple, collected these deposition materials, and edited them into 2 volumes, which we have today as the Gospel of Luke and Book of Acts, and shared them with Paul's disciples in Rome. Both the Epistle to the Romans, and the Gospel of Luke, where the use of abuso occur, were written to citizens of the city of Rome. And that is where we find the Greek word, abuso, used to refer to the place of the dead. Because in Rome, that is where you would find the dead buried. Both the Gospel of Luke and the Epistle to the Romans were written to Roman audiences. Both contained material which originated from Paul addressing Romans, and both documents used the term abuso to speak of the place of the dead to Romans in Rome. This is very significant because, in both of these books, that particular phrase is used with one specific audience in mind, the citizens of Rome. And that particular phrase will not appear anywhere else in the entire New Testament, outside of its use in the book of Revelation by John. Nowhere else. You have 3 sources, from 3 authors, and 2 of those sources outside of Revelation are from other authors, but they both address an audience in Rome, and both use this term the same way. And oddly and completely inconsistent with its normal use in the Septuagint they were teaching out of. So why did the Gospel of Luke and Epistle to the Romans both use abuso when they were addressing Roman audiences to refer to the place of the dead? In Luke we find the first use of it in the New Testament, and the use of this term is very illustrative with regard to how it is also being used in the book of Revelation. And even though the story offered to the Roman audience is described in a setting which takes place in Judea with Christ, it is actually confronting something very prominent in the city of Rome. Very important to Roman society, and culture, and religious and spiritual practice. The story Luke is about to tell will cut at the very heart of something in Roman culture, and be very, very confrontational and controversial. And its use in the Epistle to the Romans by Paul makes the reference to that very same term a very unmistakable reference to something that citizens of Rome would all be very, very familiar with. And in both references, in both instances, both addressing audiences of Romans located in the city of Rome, the use of the term refers to the place of the dead. Not a mythological pit that is bottomless, that goes through the earth into some other dimension, or has no bottom to it. As you will see in a minute, it just simply doesn't mean that. And here is how we know. In Luke, remember this text is addressing a Roman audience, we find the story of the demoniac man who comes running out from the tombs to Christ, and the demons cry out to Christ, calling themselves Legion, which is a Roman military unit. Let me repeat that again, this term is a Roman military unit, and this legion of demons are begging Christ not to be sent back, and here comes that term, to, the abuso. They came from the abuso, and they do not want to be sent back to the abuso. That is the term used in that text in Luke, written to Romans. Abuso. And not accidentally, that is the very same term, also used in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1. The reason you find this term in both of these places, is because they were referring to the very same thing. The text in Luke, says the man is living, among the tombs. How can someone live among the tombs? Tombs are buried by dirt, are they not? Is that a reference to a cemetery? No, actually it's not. And that is why this term, addressing this Roman audience, is used. Precisely why. A homeless person might live in a cemetery, but they would still be exposed to the open air elements such as cold, rain, burning heat from the sun, etc. But in ancient Israel, like many places in the ancient world, they did not bury their dead in simple cemeteries like we have today. Nor did they do that in ancient Rome. And the use of this phrase here, to this Roman audience, is very important to both contexts. Because, in Israel their tombs were made out of caves, or an area of honeycombed caves, cut into the earth, in the side of cliffs. This practice wouldn't really solicit the term, abuso, to describe a place of the dead, because there is no water associated with it at all. But to the Roman audience, to whom this literature was being written to, they would have a practice for their dead that would make using the term abuso to them an extremely appropriate reference. Why? Because in Rome, the place of the dead was an area we know today by the term catacombs. In both instances, there were subterranean areas that were built or carved out of stone in which to bury the dead. The use of the term in both instances referred to this place of the dead. The example or story is being told about what happened in Israel, but the audience it is being told to are Romans, and it is being told to them for a specific reason about their burial practices, using a particular term, like the term legion itself, that they as Romans would fully understand. They understood the association of the dead with water, and they understood the use of the term translated as pit, but really means a well. They will understand these references in the city of Rome because of the Roman catacombs. You can see in the story in Luke that the man came out of this place, running at Christ, and the demons did not want to be sent back to it, so it is rather obvious he wasn't in a bottomless pit, and neither were his demons, when Luke uses that term abuso. The man in the tombs got his demons from those tombs, not a bottomless pit. Luke is referring in the text to where the demoniac had just come from, and it was the same place where his demons did not want to return to. And Luke also point blank tells you in the text where he was. It was from among the tombs, not a bottomless pit. There is nothing about a bottomless pit in any way, shape or form in Luke chapter 8. There is something, however, about crypts and catacombs. As you can see on your screen, there are a number of translations shown dealing with the use of that term in Luke chapter 8 verse 31. And the only translation, the only one, that translates its usage in Luke chapter 8 verse 31 as a bottomless pit is in the rather infamous International Standard Version or ISV, which has been notoriously influenced by Counter-reformation word selections. It is virtually the only one. And why did the ISV do that? To protect the translation of the word in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1. Because if you translate that word into what it literally means, the text in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1 is going to start to look much more recognizable and realistic to the modern public. And that is precisely what you do not want, if you are a counter-reformationist. You see, everyone knows there is no such thing as a bottomless pit, so obviously no prophecy that centers on an event around one will ever happen. So the problem created for Rome in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1 goes poof, and simply goes away. And it is pretty obvious to any reader that the demoniac, with his legion of demons, in Luke chapter 8 verse 31, did not come running at Christ out of an interdimensional bottomless pit. He and his demons came running out at Christ out of the tombs that he was living in. It was a catacomb area of tombs, where he could find shelter from the elements. He could crawl up in one of those caves, along with a dead body in it, and stay dry. And unfortunately, also get demonized in the process. That was the warning to the Roman audience, from Luke. And when this demoniac found Christ, not even his demons wanted to go back to those tombs. Why was that such a powerful message to a Roman? Because of what Romans used to do in their catacombs. Everyone knows there is something called the catacombs. And the very term itself, the catacombs, which is a subterranean place of the dead, begins to immediately recall specific places and times in real history to just about anyone you mention the term to on the street. And no place on earth is as famous for its catacombs than the very city of Rome, to whom both Luke and Paul were addressing when they uniquely and specifically used that term, abuso. And no one else did in the New Testament but them. Not Matthew, not James, not Peter, not Jude, etc. The only place that term is used outside of the book of Revelation in the entire New Testament is used only when it is addressing a Roman audience in the city of Rome. That is the only place you will find that term used. The second usage found in the Epistle to the Romans, chapter 10, verse 7, simply reinforces the way the reference in Luke 8 is used. It is once again as a term which refers to a subterranean place of the dead, a catacomb, not a bottomless pit. In Romans 10 verse 7, Paul says, quote, "Or, who shall descend into the abuso?" That is, to bring up Christ again from the dead. End quote. Paul is once again using that term to clearly refer to the place of the dead. And the term, abuso, has an association with water. He uses the term descend to describe going into it, and uses the term ascend to describe coming out of it. And that is what Romans physically had to do when entering the catacombs. They went down to go into them, and they went up when they came out of them. In Israel, the tombs were catacombed into caves in the side of cliffs. You went in and came out sideways, you did not go down and come back up. But Paul was addressing a Roman audience in the Epistle to the Romans. And he was referencing their burial practices, their place of the dead. And Paul specifically calls that place, using the term, the abuso, quote, the dead, end quote. That is the term he uses for it collectively, simply, the dead. Every Roman knew exactly what that meant, and where they were, and what Paul was making a literal reference to, physically, in their immediate historical environment. So why was there a unique association with water, employing the term, abuso, for the Romans, that the Hebrews never made? Hebrew culture existed in an arid climate, near desert areas. Their theology posited earth beneath and heaven above. The place of the dead, in Sheol, was simply a place in the earth, precisely where they buried their dead. There was no water there, because there was no water in the environment where they were buried, to associate with it. It just wasn't a major component of their conceptualization of the afterlife. However, in Roman paganism, the ancient Romans thought of a person in the afterlife as traveling on underground rivers, and the physical place they were buried in, the catacombs, would fill up with water during storms, because originally, the catacombs were the underground drainage system for the city of Rome. They were later converted into burial spaces for the dead. So these areas in the Roman catacombs, often filled with water, and became very watery graves. And these differences in Roman burial practices in the water drainage system, in Roman conceptions of the afterlife traveling on underground rivers, and in the actual watery burial environment itself, uniquely in the city of Rome, is reflected in the New Testament's use of the term, abuso, when addressing a Roman audience about the dead. So in Rome, water featured both physically and spiritually, as a very prominent aspect in the afterlife. And the underground waters became a direct association for the place of the dead, and thus the use of the term, abuso, in the New Testament, when addressing Roman audiences. What we find in both uses in the Gospel of Luke and in the Epistle to the Romans, is clearly a reference, not to a pit without a bottom, but to the very well-known area which was a watery subterranean place of the dead, in the city of Rome, known today as the Catacombs. And the usage of abuso denoted both the watery physical crypt or catacomb, and its spiritual state, of that very same place of the dead, in Rome. It is clearly a New Testament reference to the watery subterranean place of the dead, in Rome. Paul's use of the term in Romans, being written literally to the very city of Rome, would have literally been a specific reference to the Roman catacombs itself, directed at Paul's Roman audience. Even Jews in the city of Rome were buried in the city's catacombs. But as you see in the book of Luke, no Jew in his right mind would make a practice of hanging out in them, unless they wanted to become possessed with demons. And thus the associations with Roman demons, you also see in the book of Luke. And don't forget, Luke was in fact pointing this out specifically to his Roman readers, that these demons were Roman demons in the tombs, because they used the very familiar Roman reference to legion. Under Jewish law, the dead were considered unclean. Jewish associations with the dead were unclean and demonic only, precisely as you saw in the story about the man who dwelled in the tombs. He was considered a demoniac, because touching the dead made one unclean. It was a mental association for Jewish minds to associate dead bodies with sin, devils and evil only. Not something holy. That is why in the story in Luke, the man that lived among the tombs was described as a demoniac, full of a legion of demons. To a Jewish mind, that would pretty much go without even having to be said. Of course he was demonized. That's where the demons would naturally live, in Jewish thought. Among dead corpses feeding on rotting unclean flesh. That is precisely how the Jewish mind thought of these kinds of places, as crypts, catacombs and tombs. But you can see why the last thing a counter-reformationist wants is the public thinking of the concept or term, catacombs, when reading Revelation chapter 9 verse 1. But the use of the phrase, the free autos of the abuso, literally means the well of the dead. Or the catacombs of the dead. The literal phrase, the well of the dead, especially as used by Paul, would have been an historically contexted reference, written to his Roman audience, to refer by Paul, to Rome's own catacombs, which was their watery subterranean place of the dead. Now its use in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1 becomes clear, as precisely the very same exact kind of literal historical reference, completely hidden by Counter-Reformation influence on theology and translation work. And as you see, the more influence they exert on the translation work, the more they gravitate to a mythical bottomless pit which not only doesn't exist, but never will. Precisely because it's mythological only. No bottomless pit, therefore there will never be a key from it, ever, and thus, no Antichrist ever. Problem solved. Except, of course, that translation has no basis whatsoever in the language in the actual text. The only thing bottomless about the Greek term abuso, in the New Testament, is to what lengths today's counter-reformationists will go to hide its literal historical meaning, and what they were in the very immediate context of the city of Rome, literally and actually referring to, in all of its uses, in the New Testament, from Paul, to Luke, to John. And just in case you really don't believe what you just heard, John reiterates his complaints against these practices at the end of the chapter. After all the misery and mayhem he will grocery list in chapter 9, he ends the chapter with a complaint that even despite all these things, these men will not repent of their idolatry and their sorcery. What did Romans do in these catacombs that Luke and Paul and John were all three complaining about? If you guessed idolatry and sorcery, you were correct. Thus John's closing comments. Romans set up idols of their ancestors and practiced sorcery, or necromancy, conjuring up the spirit of their dead relatives, and communicating with the dead, just as they still do today in the Catholic Church with its saints and relics and images and statues. All practices, which emerged out of Rome's catacombs. And John says in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1, that the Antichrist's key of authority will come from this watery subterranean place of the dead, this well of the dead, the catacombs, which were very familiar to his ancient readers. And by the way, thought of as completely and totally demonic, to the mind of any Orthodox Jewish Christian from the New Testament, precisely as you see written in Luke chapter 8, where the term, abuso, is also used. And now you know what key to be actually looking for, and where it actually really comes from, in John's prophecy. And it isn't a fictitious mythological bottomless pit that doesn't exist, and never will, as they tried to tell the public. It is something very, very real, and you don't have to go very far at all, to find it, and see it for what it is. All you have to do, is take a guided tour of ancient Rome that includes a visit to the catacombs. And you will have found John's reference in Revelation chapter 9 verse 1, to the abuso, incorrectly translated as the bottomless pit. The abuso is where the Romans buried their dead, in the city of Rome. See Romans chapter 10 verse 7. Today we call this the catacombs. These are the kinds of things counter-reformationist ministers spend all their time and money on, hiding from the public and lying about, with fantastical stories about bottomless pits and zombie-making locust fantasies they call the end times. Now that you have seen that the Antichrist's key of authority comes from the place of the dead known today as the catacombs, which Paul referred to as the abuso, translated into English as the abyss, and not a mythological bottomless pit, we will look at the next distortion the Counter-Reformation uses concerning scorpion men, and how they use that silly and ridiculous claim to intentionally hide a very well-known reference to papal military history. Thank you for watching.